The morning air at Haven Ridge Elementary carried the usual sounds of childhood laughter and shuffling feet, but what happened next would shatter the illusion of safety forever. Officer Elena Ruiz adjusted Shadow's tactical vest one final time as they approached the school's main entrance, the German shepherd's muscles rippling beneath his black and tan coat like a weapon forged from loyalty and instinct. This was supposed to be routine, another canine demonstration for Safety Day, another chance to show wide-eyed children how dogs like Shadow tracked criminals through swamps and sniffed out danger in the darkest corners of society. Elena had done this presentation dozens of times, watching kids giggle as Shadow performed his tricks, their innocent faces lighting up when he located hidden objects or demonstrated takedown procedures on padded volunteers. But as they walked through those familiar hallways, neither Elena nor Shadow could have predicted that today would mark the beginning of a case that would haunt them both, a case where silence spoke louder than screams, and where a single bark would become the voice of a child who had been robbed of her own. The linoleum floors reflected the morning sunlight streaming through tall windows, creating patterns of light and shadow that seemed to dance around their feet as they made their way toward the gymnasium. Children pressed against classroom doors, their faces pressed to glass windows like eager spectators waiting for a show, teachers waving and calling out greetings to the familiar duo who had become local heroes in their small community. Shadow's ears twitched at every sound, his dark eyes scanning the environment with the practiced vigilance of a warrior who understood that danger could lurk behind the most innocent facades. Elena felt the familiar weight of her duty settling across her shoulders like an invisible cloak, the responsibility she carried not just as a police officer, but as Shadow's partner, his human voice in a world that often ignored the warnings only he could sense. What neither of them knew was that in just a few minutes, Shadow would encounter something that would trigger every protective instinct he possessed, something that would transform a routine school visit into a desperate race against time, to save a life that hung in the balance between truth and deception, between silence and salvation. The wheelchair made almost no sound as it glided across the polished hallway tiles, its occupant so small and pale she seemed to fade into the shadows cast by the overhead fluorescent lights. Clara sat motionless, her thin hands folded in her lap like wilted flowers, her dark eyes staring at nothing, while the woman behind her pushed with mechanical precision. Melissa Fay's perfume hung in the air like a cloying cloud, her smile stretched tight across her face as she nodded politely to the officers, but there was something in her eyes that didn't match the pleasantries rolling off. Her tongue. Shadow had been walking calmly beside Elena, his training keeping him focused and composed, but the moment that wheelchair entered his peripheral vision, everything changed. His ears snapped forward like satellite dishes locking onto a signal, his entire body going rigid, as if an electric current had suddenly surged through his nervous system. Elena felt the change immediately through the leash, that subtle shift in tension that spoke of danger in a language only she and Shadow shared. Then it happened with the explosive force of a dam bursting under pressure. Shadow lunged forward with such violence that Elena nearly lost her footing, his massive frame straining against the tactical harness as a sound erupted from his throat that made every person in that hallway freeze in terror. This wasn't the controlled bark of a demonstration or the playful sound of a dog at play. This was something primal and desperate, a sound that seemed to tear itself from the very depths of his soul. His hackles rose like black spears along his spine, his lips pulled back to reveal fangs that gleamed white against his dark gums, and his eyes locked onto that little girl with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Elena yanked back on the leash with all her strength, her boots sliding on the smooth floor as she fought to control her partner, but Shadow continued to surge forward, his barks becoming more frantic with each passing second. The sound echoed off the walls like gunshots, causing children to scatter and teachers to rush forward in confusion and alarm. But it was Clara's reaction that sent ice through Elena's veins, because when those dark eyes lifted to meet Shadow's gaze, there was no fear there, only recognition, and something else that made Elena's blood run cold. A silent plea that seemed to whisper from the depths of a nightmare that had no end. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel Canine Loyal Souls, where we uncover true stories of animals' bravery. You won't believe until you see it, and tell us in the comments, what city are you watching us from? In the sprawling landscape of American law enforcement, where technology advances at breakneck speed and criminals adapt with cunning precision, there exists a partnership that transcends the boundaries between species, a bond forged in trust, loyalty, and an understanding that runs deeper than words could ever express. Canine units represent the apex of this collaboration, where highly trained dogs work alongside their human handlers to protect communities, solve crimes, and save lives in ways that would be impossible for either species alone. These four-legged heroes possess sensory capabilities that border on the supernatural, able to detect scents invisible to human perception, hear frequencies that escape our ears, and sense danger through instincts honed by thousands of years of evolution. But beyond their remarkable abilities lies something even more profound, an emotional intelligence that allows them to read human suffering with an accuracy that often surpasses trained professionals, to recognize deception when it hides behind friendly smiles, and to respond to cries for help that exist only in silence. The story you're about to witness unfolds in the quiet corridors of a small elementary school, where the routine demonstration of police work was about to become something far more sinister and complex. Officer Elena Ruiz had dedicated her career to serving her community, patrolling the streets where she grew up, responding to domestic disputes that echoed her own childhood traumas, and building bridges between law enforcement and the families who sometimes feared the very people sworn to protect them. But it was her partnership with Shadow, a German shepherd whose instincts had been sharpened through years of intensive training, that would prove to be the key to unlocking a mystery that had remained hidden in plain sight. Shadow wasn't just a police dog, he was a living lie detector, a guardian angel with fur and fangs, whose keen senses had been responsible for locating missing persons in dense forests, uncovering drug operations hidden in the most unlikely places, and detecting explosives that could have claimed countless innocent lives. His training had begun as a puppy, when handlers recognized the rare combination of intelligence, courage, and empathy that would make him exceptional in the field. Through countless hours of conditioning, Shadow had learned to read human emotions with startling accuracy, to distinguish between legitimate fear and the terror that accompanies guilt, and to trust his instincts even when logic suggested otherwise. On this particular morning, his extraordinary abilities would be put to the ultimate test in ways no training manual could have prepared him for. What began as a simple educational visit would evolve into a desperate race against time, where every bark carried the weight of a child's future, where silence became the loudest scream, and where the bond between human and animal would prove stronger than the forces of evil that had sought to destroy an innocent life. This is the story of how one dog's refusal to remain quiet saved a girl who had been forced into silence, and how sometimes the greatest acts of heroism come not from those who speak the loudest, but from those who listen with their hearts and respond with unwavering courage when darkness threatens to consume the light. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Haven Ridge Elementary as Officer Elena Ruiz adjusted Shadow's service vest one final time, her fingers running along the familiar contours of the tactical harness that had become as much a part of their routine as her own uniform. The German shepherd stood at attention beside the patrol car, his dark eyes scanning the playground where children's laughter echoed off brick walls and chain-link fences, his ears twitching at every sound as if cataloging potential threats in a mental database that never stopped updating. Eleanor had performed this demonstration dozens of times at schools across the district, but she never grew tired of watching young faces light up with wonder as Shadow showed off his remarkable abilities, transforming what could be a sterile presentation about law enforcement into an interactive experience that built trust between police and the community they served. The school's main entrance buzzed with activity as teachers herded excited students toward the gymnasium, their voices creating a symphony of anticipation that seemed to energize the very air around them. Principal Martinez greeted Elena at the front doors with the kind of warm smile that suggested genuine appreciation for the time and effort officers like her invested in connecting with children, understanding that these positive interactions could shape a young person's perception of law enforcement for years to come. Shadow's claws clicked against the polished linoleum as they made their way through hallways lined with colorful artwork and motivational posters, past classroom doors where curious faces pressed against windows like flowers turning towards sunlight. The gymnasium smelled of disinfectant and rubber mats, its high ceiling amplifying every sound as students filed in with the controlled chaos that marked school assemblies everywhere. Eleanor had prepared her usual presentation about canine units, complete with demonstrations of Shadow's ability to track scents, locate hidden objects, and respond to various commands that showcased the months of intensive training both dog and handler underwent to work effectively as a team. But as she watched the children settle into their designated spots on the floor, their eyes wide with excitement and anticipation, she couldn't shake the feeling that today would be different somehow, that beneath the familiar routine of commands and tricks lay something darker waiting to emerge. Shadow seemed to sense it too, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a subtle restlessness that only Elena would notice, the way his tail held slightly lower than normal, how his breathing had become more shallow and focused. The presentation began with Elena explaining the role of police dogs in modern law enforcement, how these specially trained animals could detect substances human noses couldn't perceive, track suspects across miles of difficult terrain, and provide protection for officers in dangerous situations. Shadow performed flawlessly, demonstrating his ability to find a hidden tennis ball in less than 30 seconds, responding to hand signals that directed his movements with military precision, and even allowing brave volunteers to pet his thick coat, while Elena explained the importance of never approaching working dogs without permission. The children applauded with the unbridled enthusiasm that only elementary school audiences could muster, their questions ranging from what Shadow liked to eat to whether he ever got scared during dangerous missions, each query answered with the patience and genuine care that had made Elena popular among teachers and students alike throughout the district. The moment that would change everything arrived without fanfare or warning, as significant events often do, sliding into reality with the quiet inevitability of fate itself. Clara's wheelchair appeared at the gymnasium entrance like a ghost materializing from shadows, its occupant so small and fragile she seemed to disappear against the black vinyl seat that dwarfed her tiny frame. The 8-year-old girl sat with her hands folded in her lap, her pale skin almost translucent in the harsh fluorescent lighting, dark hair hanging like curtains around a face that held the hollow emptiness of someone who had learned that speaking only brought pain. Behind her, Melissa Fay pushed the wheelchair with practiced efficiency, her movements smooth and controlled as she navigated through the crowd of seated children, her smile never wavering, even as her eyes darted around the room with the calculating awareness of a predator assessing potential threats. The woman's appearance was unremarkable in the way that true danger often disguised itself, middle-aged and matronly with graying hair pulled back in a sensible style, wearing the kind of modest clothing that suggested respectability and care, her voice pitched at exactly the right frequency to convey maternal concern when she spoke to teachers and administrators. But Shadow felt the wrongness immediately, every instinct honed through years of training and countless encounters with human deception, screaming warnings that his human partner couldn't yet hear. His body language shifted subtly at first, ears rotating forward like radar dishes, locking onto a signal, nostrils flaring as he processed scents that carried stories no human could read, muscles tensing. Beneath his thick coat, as ancient evolutionary programming recognized the presence of something that threatened the pack, Elena noticed the change in her partner's demeanor, but couldn't identify its source, her own senses failing to detect what Shadow's superior abilities had already catalogued and filed under immediate danger. The demonstration continued for several more minutes, but Shadow's attention remained divided, part of him still responding to Elena's commands, while another part tracked the wheelchair's progress around the gymnasium's perimeter, his dark eyes following Clara's movements with an intensity that bordered on obsession. When Melissa finally positioned the wheelchair near the exit, claiming they needed to leave early for a medical appointment, Shadow's restraint finally shattered, like glass under pressure. The explosion of movement happened so quickly that Elena barely had time to process what was occurring before her partner launched himself toward the wheelchair. With a force that nearly yanked the leash from her hands, his massive frame propelled by desperation and protective instinct that overrode months of disciplined training. The bark that erupted from his throat wasn't the controlled sound of a demonstration or the playful noise of an excited dog, but something primal and terrifying that seemed to tear itself from the very depths of his soul, a sound that made every person in that gymnasium freeze in shock and terror. Children screamed and scattered as Shadow strained against his harness, his lips pulled back to reveal gleaming fangs, hackles raised like black spears along his spine, as he focused every ounce of his considerable strength on reaching the little girl who sat motionless in her wheelchair, watching the chaos unfold with eyes that held recognition rather than fear. Elena felt the world shift around her as Shadow's protective instincts transformed him from trained police dog into something far more elemental and dangerous, his powerful hindquarters bunching with muscle as he fought against the tactical harness that was all that stood between him and the wheelchair that had triggered this unprecedented reaction. The leather leash cut into her palms as she braced her feet against the polished gymnasium floor, her training kicking in even as her mind struggled to process what was happening. Years of partnership with Shadow telling her that his behavior meant something catastrophic was occurring, even if she couldn't see it herself. The sound of his barking filled the cavernous space like thunder, each vocalization carrying a note of desperation that made Elena's blood run cold, because in 5 years of working together, Shadow had never, not once, displayed this level of agitation during a routine public demonstration. Melissa Fay's carefully constructed mask of maternal concern began to slip as she found herself at the center of unwanted attention, her hands gripping the wheelchair handles with white-knuckled intensity as she attempted to maneuver Clara toward the exit, while maintaining the pretense that nothing unusual was occurring. But Shadow's focused aggression made subtlety impossible, his massive frame lunging forward with each bark, straining against the harness with enough force to drag Elena several steps before she could regain her footing and pull him back. Teachers rushed forward to help control the situation, their faces painted with confusion and concern as they tried to understand why a dog known for his calm demeanor and perfect training had suddenly become a snarling, desperate creature who seemed intent on reaching a disabled child. Principal Martinez approached with his hands raised in a calming gesture, his voice pitched low and soothing as he tried to de-escalate what was rapidly becoming a public relations nightmare. But Shadow ignored him completely, his entire focus locked on Clara with laser-like intensity. The little girl herself remained eerily still throughout the chaos, her dark eyes fixed on Shadow's face with an expression that Elena would later describe as recognition mixed with desperate hope, as if she were watching a rescue that she had dreamed about, but never dared to believe might actually come. Melissa's voice rose above the commotion as she began to voice complaints about the dangerous dog that was clearly poorly trained and shouldn't be around children, her words carrying just the right note of righteous indignation to make the assembled adults question Shadow's behavior rather than her own presence. But Elena had worked with her partner long enough to know the difference between aggression, born of poor training, and the focused determination of a dog who had detected something that demanded immediate action. She could feel the tremor in Shadow's muscles, see the way his nostrils flared as he processed scents that painted a picture her human senses couldn't perceive, watch how his eyes never left Clara's face, even as the adults around them debated his behavior and questioned his reliability. The gymnasium that had moments before been filled with children's laughter now echoed with tension and confusion as Elena made the split-second decision that would define everything that followed, trusting her partner's instincts over the protests of well-meaning adults who couldn't see what Shadow's superior senses had already detected and catalogued as an emergency requiring immediate intervention. The ride back to the police station passed in tense silence, Elena's hands gripping the steering wheel as she replayed the gymnasium incident in her mind, searching for clues she might have missed, while Shadow sat in the back seat, his breathing still elevated from the confrontation that had shattered his usual professional composure. The image of Clara's face haunted Elena's thoughts, the way those dark eyes had met Shadow's gaze without fear, the almost imperceptible nod she thought she had seen pass between dog and child in that moment before Melissa had whisked the wheelchair away with practiced efficiency. Shadow's behavior continued to trouble Elena long after they had returned to the familiar confines of the station, his restlessness manifesting in pacing that wore grooves in her consciousness, the way he kept returning to the window that faced toward Haven Ridge Elementary, as if he could will himself back to that gymnasium through sheer determination. Captain Rodriguez called Elena into his office within an hour of their return, his weathered face creased with concern as he asked for a detailed report about the incident that had already generated phone calls from the school district and worried parents who had witnessed Shadow's unprecedented display of aggression. Elena found herself in the uncomfortable position of defending her partner's actions without being able to explain them, knowing that Shadow's track record of perfect behavior and accurate threat assessment should speak for itself, but understanding that public perception often mattered more than professional competence. She walked the captain through every detail she could remember, from the moment Clara's wheelchair had entered the gymnasium to the final bark that had echoed off the walls like a warning shot, emphasizing Shadow's years of flawless service and his proven ability to detect dangers that human senses couldn't perceive. The captain listened with the patient expression of a man who had learned to trust the instincts of his officers, both human and canine, but who also understood the political realities of maintaining community support for police programs that could be cancelled if public confidence wavered. After Elena finished her report, Captain Rodriguez leaned back in his chair and studied her with eyes that had seen enough in 30 years of law enforcement to recognize when something didn't add up, his fingers drumming against the desk as he processed the implications of what she had told him. The official recommendation was to conduct a follow-up investigation, nothing formal or accusatory, just a wellness check disguised as a courtesy call to ensure that the child hadn't been traumatized by Shadow's behavior and to maintain positive relations with the school community. But Elena heard the subtext in her captain's words, the unspoken acknowledgement that Shadow's reputation for accuracy meant his reaction deserved serious consideration rather than dismissal as an anomaly or training failure. That evening, Elena sat in her apartment with Shadow lying at her feet, his dark eyes reflecting the light from the television as she researched everything she could find about Clara Jennings and her guardian Melissa Fay, her laptop screen casting blue shadows across their faces as she delved into public records and social media profiles that painted a picture of carefully constructed normalcy. What she found, or rather, what she didn't find, began to crystallize. The unease that had been building since that morning's confrontation, gaps in documentation, and inconsistencies in timelines that suggested a story more complex than the simple tragedy of a disabled child and her devoted caretaker. The morning after the gymnasium incident dawned grey and overcast, with clouds hanging low over the city like a shroud that seemed to mirror Eleanor's troubled state of mind as she and Shadow made their way back to Haven Ridge Elementary under the pretense of retrieving equipment that had supposedly been left behind during the demonstration. The school hallways felt different in the early morning quiet, absent the energy and chaos of children, their footsteps echoing with hollow resonance as they retraced the path that had led to yesterday's confrontation. Shadow's behavior remained subtly altered, his usual professional demeanor replaced by an alertness that bordered on hypervigilance, his nose working constantly as he processed scents that lingered in the air, like invisible evidence of secrets hidden in plain sight. Elena watched her partner carefully as they approached the spot where Clara's wheelchair had been positioned, noting how his ears pricked forward and his tail dropped to a neutral position that she had learned to associate with his detection mode, the focused concentration he displayed when tracking suspects or searching for contraband. When Shadow suddenly sat and whined, a sound he never made during routine activities, Elena felt her pulse quicken with the recognition that he was trying to communicate something important, something that transcended the normal boundaries between species and demanded her immediate attention. She knelt beside him and followed his gaze toward the wall where motivational posters encouraged students to dream big and never give up. But Shadow's focus seemed directed at something far more specific than inspirational messages, his nostrils flaring as he processed information that painted a picture her human senses couldn't perceive. The school's guidance counselor, Linda Carrington, appeared in the hallway with a cup of coffee steaming in her hands and the expression of mild surprise at finding the K-9 team conducting what appeared to be an impromptu investigation of her workplace. Elena seized the opportunity to engage in casual conversation that might yield insights into Clara's situation, her training in interview techniques, allowing her to ask seemingly innocent questions about the children who attended the school and their family situations. Linda proved to be a goldmine of information, disguised as friendly chatter, her professional concern for her students evident in the way she discussed their individual challenges and triumphs. But when the conversation turned to Clara Jennings, Elena noticed a subtle shift in the woman's demeanor that suggested deeper concerns than she was initially willing to voice. The guidance counselor's hesitation spoke volumes about professional obligations that prevented her from sharing specific details about students, but Elena could read between the lines of carefully chosen words and meaningful pauses that painted a picture of a child who had raised red flags without triggering formal intervention. Linda's suggestion that they continue their conversation over coffee later that day carried the weight of someone who had been waiting for an excuse to share concerns that had been building for months, concerns that professional protocol had prevented her from voicing until now. As Elena and Shadow prepared to leave the school, the German shepherd paused at the main entrance and looked back toward the hallway where they had encountered Clara, his body language conveying a reluctance to abandon whatever he had detected there, his dark eyes holding an intelligence that sometimes made Elena wonder if he understood far more about human nature than any dog should be capable of comprehending. The drive to the coffee shop passed in contemplative silence, Elena's mind racing with possibilities, while Shadow maintained his vigil from the back seat, his reflection in the rearview mirror serving as a constant reminder that their investigation had only just begun. The coffee shop buzzed with the comfortable murmur of morning conversations and the hiss of espresso machines, but Eleanor found herself leaning forward across the small table as Linda Carrington's voice dropped to a whisper that carried the weight of professional secrets and mounting concern for a child who had somehow slipped through the cracks of a system designed to protect the vulnerable. Linda's weathered hands trembled slightly as she opened a manila folder that she claimed she probably shouldn't be sharing, her eyes darting around the cafe to ensure their conversation remained private, while she revealed details that had been haunting her professional conscience for weeks. The first item she withdrew from the folder made Eleanor's blood run cold. A child's drawing rendered in crayon with the innocent technique of an 8-year-old, but depicting imagery that no child should have been exposed to, let alone been compelled to express, through art therapy sessions that had been disguised as recreational activities. The drawing showed a small figure standing upright in what appeared to be a field or open space, her legs clearly visible and functional, while behind her loomed a larger figure whose face had been scribbled over with angry red marks that suggested rage or violence. The crayon applied with enough pressure to tear through the paper in several places, but it was the detail in the background that made Elena's stomach clench with recognition, a smaller figure on the ground, connected to the larger one, by what could only be interpreted as a leash or rope, the implications of which painted a picture of captivity and control that went far beyond physical disability. Linda's voice cracked with emotion as she explained how Clara had initially claimed the drawing represented a made-up story, a fantasy character she had invented for entertainment, but when pressed for details about the walking figure, the child had whispered words that had echoed in Linda's mind for days afterward. "That's who I used to be." The guidance counselor's professional training had taught her to recognize signs of trauma and abuse, but Clara's case presented unique challenges that made traditional assessment tools inadequate for determining whether her concerns were justified or simply the product of an overactive imagination, combined with the natural adjustment difficulties any child might experience after a life-altering injury. Linda shared her growing suspicions about inconsistencies in Clara's medical history, the lack of hospital records documenting the accident that had supposedly left her paralyzed, and the absence of any educational documentation prior to her enrollment at Haven Ridge 6 months earlier, as if the child had simply materialized from nowhere with a fully formed identity and tragic backstory. The conversation turned to Melissa Fay, whose behavior Linda described as simultaneously overprotective and oddly detached, a woman who seemed to know all the right things to say about caring for a disabled child, but whose emotional responses felt rehearsed rather than genuine, as if she were playing a role rather than living a reality. Elena listened with growing alarm as Linda described incidents that had raised red flags without providing clear evidence of wrongdoing, bruises on Clara's back that Melissa had attributed to falls from her wheelchair, the child's tendency to flinch when touched unexpectedly, and her habit of asking permission before speaking as if she had been conditioned to believe that her voice required authorization from others. The most disturbing revelation came when Linda admitted that she had witnessed Clara attempting to stand during a bathroom break, her legs supporting her weight, for several seconds before she quickly collapsed back into her wheelchair upon hearing Melissa's approaching footsteps. The incident dismissed as muscle spasms when questioned, but leaving Linda with doubts that had festered like infected wounds in her professional conscience. The decision to return to Clara's classroom required careful planning and diplomatic maneuvering, Elena leveraging her relationship with the school administration to arrange what appeared to be a routine follow-up visit, designed to rebuild positive associations between the K-9 program and students who might have been frightened by Shadow's previous behavior. Principal Martinez readily agreed to the proposal, his eagerness to maintain good relations with the police department, overriding any concerns about disrupting classroom schedules, and Elena found herself once again walking the familiar hallways of Haven Ridge Elementary with Shadow at her side, his demeanor noticeably more controlled, but still radiating an alertness that suggested his protective instincts remained fully engaged. The third-grade classroom smelled of glue sticks and construction paper, its walls decorated with seasonal artwork and motivational posters that created a cheerful environment designed to nurture young minds. But Eleanor's attention remained focused on the small figure seated in a wheelchair near the back of the room. Clara's pale face turned toward the window, as if she were studying something far more interesting than the K-9 demonstration taking place just a few feet away. Elena kept her presentation light and engaging, allowing Shadow to perform simple tricks that drew laughter and applause from the assembled children while she maintained peripheral awareness of Clara's reactions, noting how the girl's hands gripped the arms of her wheelchair whenever Melissa moved within her line of sight, the subtle tension that seemed to radiate from her small frame like heat from a fever. When Elena announced that volunteers could pet Shadow if they raised their hands and waited for permission, nearly every child in the room shot their arms skyward with enthusiastic eagerness, but Clara's response was different, her hand rising slowly and tentatively as if she expected to be denied or punished for expressing interest in the activity. Elena guided Shadow toward Clara's wheelchair with deliberate casualness, kneeling beside the child and speaking in low, gentle tones about the proper way to approach a working dog. But her real attention focused on Clara's eyes, searching for any sign of the recognition she had glimpsed during their previous encounter. Shadow's behavior around Clara was markedly different from his interactions with the other children, his usual professional distance replaced by an almost protective stance, his massive head lowering to rest gently against the girl's knee, while his dark eyes remained fixed on her face as if he were trying to communicate something that transcended the barriers between species. The moment that changed everything happened so quickly that Elena almost missed it, Clara's small hand slipping something beneath Shadow's collar with movements so subtle they could have been mistaken for normal petting motions, her fingers working with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to hide things from observant eyes. Elena's training kicked in automatically, her expression remaining neutral, even as her pulse quickened with the realization that Clara had just passed her some form of communication, a message that required stealth and secrecy to deliver safely. The remainder of the classroom visit passed in a blur of forced normalcy, Elena maintaining her educational presentation while mentally cataloguing every detail of Clara's behavior and Melissa's reactions, noting how the woman's smile never quite reached her eyes and how her hand rested possessively on the back of Clara's wheelchair, like a claim of ownership rather than a gesture of care. When the visit concluded and Elena guided Shadow back toward the classroom door, she could feel the weight of whatever Clara had hidden in her partner's collar, a physical reminder that their investigation had just taken a dramatic turn that would require careful handling to avoid triggering consequences that could put the child in even greater danger than she might already be facing. The patrol car's interior felt charged with tension as Elena sat in the driver's seat with the engine idling, her hands trembling slightly as she reached toward Shadow's collar where Clara's desperate message lay hidden beneath the thick leather and metal hardware that marked him as a working police dog. Shadow remained perfectly still during the retrieval process, his dark eyes fixed on Elena's face, with an intensity that suggested he understood the gravity of what had just transpired, his breathing slow and controlled, as if he were afraid that any sudden movement might somehow compromise the evidence. That could be the key to saving a child's life. The folded piece of paper felt impossibly small between Elena's fingers, its edges worn soft as if it had been carried for days or weeks, waiting for the right moment and the right person to receive its crucial message. And when she finally unfolded it completely, the 4 words written in shaky, childlike handwriting hit her like a physical blow that left her gasping for air in the confines of the vehicle. "Help me, she lies," stared back at her. From the crumpled paper, each letter formed with the careful precision of someone who understood that this might be their only chance to communicate the truth. The desperate plea of a child who had learned that survival sometimes depended on silence, but who had finally found the courage to risk everything on the hope that someone would listen and believe. Elena read the message 3 times before the full implications settled into her consciousness like lead weights. The realization that Clara's paralysis might be fabricated, that Melissa Fay was not the devoted caretaker she pretended to be, and that Shadow's protective instincts had detected a level of deception and abuse that transcended anything Elena had encountered in her years of law enforcement. The evidence was compelling but circumstantial, a child's drawing that could be dismissed as imagination, behavioral observations that might be explained by trauma from a legitimate accident, and now a note that defense attorneys would argue could have been written by anyone seeking attention or trying to cause trouble for an innocent caregiver. But Elena had learned to trust Shadow's instincts above all else, and his unprecedented reaction to Clara, combined with this written plea, created a picture that demanded immediate action, regardless of the legal challenges they might face in building a case that could withstand scrutiny in court. She photographed the note with her phone before carefully placing it in an evidence bag, her training taking over as she documented the chain of custody that would be crucial if this case ever reached trial. But her mind was already racing ahead to the next steps in an investigation that would require delicate maneuvering to gather additional evidence without alerting Melissa to their suspicions. The drive back to the police station passed in contemplative silence, Elena's thoughts churning with possibilities and potential strategies, while Shadow maintained his vigilant watch from the back seat, his reflection in the rearview mirror serving as a constant reminder that somewhere in their city, a child was trapped in a nightmare that had been carefully disguised as loving care. Captain Rodriguez listened to Elena's briefing with the expression of a man who had seen enough in his career to know when something was seriously wrong, his weathered hands clasped tightly as she walked him through each piece of evidence they had gathered, from Shadow's initial reaction to Linda, Carrington's concerns to the desperate message that now lay sealed in an evidence bag on his desk. The captain's decision to authorize a formal welfare check came without hesitation, his trust in Elena's judgment and Shadow's proven track record overriding any concerns about political fallout or community relations, because protecting children took precedence over everything else in his hierarchy of law enforcement priorities. The trailer park on the outskirts of town squatted beneath a gray sky, like a collection of discarded dreams, its narrow streets lined with mobile homes that had seen better decades, some maintained with pride, while others surrendered to entropy and neglect, creating a patchwork landscape of hope and desperation that Elena recognized from countless domestic disturbance calls throughout her career. Melissa Fay's residence sat at the end of a gravel road that crunched beneath the patrol car's tires, its aluminum siding stained with rust and weather, while potted plants on the small front porch created an illusion of domesticity that felt somehow artificial in the harsh afternoon light. Elena approached the front door with Shadow at her heel, both of them maintaining professional composure, despite the tension that crackled between them like electricity before a storm, her hand resting casually near her service weapon, while Shadow's ears remained pricked forward in a state of controlled alertness that suggested he was prepared for anything. Melissa answered Elena's knock with the kind of surprised smile that seemed rehearsed rather than genuine, her hair pulled back in a neat bun, and her clothes carefully chosen to project an image of responsible caretaking. But Elena noticed how the woman's eyes darted quickly over her shoulder, as if checking to ensure that everything behind her remained properly arranged for unexpected inspection. The conversation began with pleasantries about following up on Clara's well-being after the incident at school. Elena's tone carefully modulated to sound concerned rather than suspicious, while she studied Melissa's micro-expressions for signs of deception or anxiety that might confirm her growing suspicions about the woman's true relationship with the child. When Elena requested to see Clara, Melissa's hesitation lasted only a fraction of a second, but it was enough to trigger every warning bell in Elena's professional experience. The brief pause, accompanied by a subtle shift in body language that suggested the woman was calculating how to respond, rather than simply accommodating a reasonable request from a concerned police officer. Melissa's excuse about Clara being tired and needing rest felt hollow and rehearsed, delivered with the kind of forced authority that people used when they were trying to convince themselves as much as their audience. But Elena pressed forward with polite insistence that gradually escalated into official determination as she explained the legal requirements. Surrounding welfare checks and child protection protocols, the sound that interrupted their conversation came from somewhere inside the trailer, a muffled thud, followed by absolute silence that made both women freeze in recognition that something had occurred beyond the range of normal household activities, and Elena saw fear flicker across Melissa's face before being quickly replaced by irritation and defensive anger. Elena's demand to enter the premises carried the weight of legal authority. Backed by reasonable suspicion, her voice taking on the commanding tone she used during high-stakes situations where compliance was not optional, and when Melissa finally stepped aside to allow entry, Elena noticed how the woman's hands trembled slightly as she gestured toward the trailer's cramped interior. The living space felt oppressive despite its modest size, cluttered with the accumulated debris of transient living and filled with an atmosphere of tension that seemed to press against Eleanor's consciousness like a physical weight, while strange smells lingered in the air that her police training had taught her to associate with substances used to incapacitate or control unwilling victims. Clara sat hunched in her wheelchair at a small table, her eyes downcast and her lips moving silently, as if she were rehearsing responses to questions that had not yet been asked, her entire posture radiating the kind of defeated submission that Elena had learned to recognize in victims of prolonged abuse who had given up hope of rescue or escape. The medical examination that followed Clara's removal from Melissa Faye's trailer revealed a systematic pattern of abuse that surpassed Elena's worst fears. Laboratory tests confirming the presence of lidocaine and other numbing agents in the child's bloodstream at levels that indicated prolonged and repeated administration designed to simulate paralysis without causing permanent physical damage. Dr. Sarah Chen, the pediatric specialist who conducted the examination, explained with clinical precision how the drugs had been used to temporarily disable Clara's motor functions while leaving her cognitive abilities intact, creating the perfect victim for a fraud scheme that had generated thousands of dollars in disability benefits and charitable donations over the course of several years. The hospital room where Clara lay recovering felt like a sanctuary after the oppressive atmosphere of the trailer, its clean white walls and gentle lighting creating an environment where healing could begin, both physical and emotional, as the toxic chemicals slowly cleared from her system and sensation gradually returned to limbs that had been artificially paralyzed for months. Eleanor sat beside the hospital bed watching Clara's face as the child processed the reality of her situation, the confusion and wonder evident in her dark eyes as she wiggled fingers and toes that responded to her commands for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, her voice barely above a whisper, as she asked whether the sensations were real or just another dream that would disappear when she woke up. Shadow had been granted special permission to visit the hospital, his presence providing emotional support that transcended anything medical science could offer, and Elena watched with amazement as Clara's entire demeanor transformed in the dog's presence, her withdrawn silence replaced by tentative smiles and even occasional laughter. As Shadow performed gentle tricks designed to encourage her physical therapy efforts, the investigation into Melissa Faye's background revealed a pattern of fraud and exploitation that stretched across multiple states, fake identities, and forged documents, creating a trail of stolen children and manufactured disabilities that had allowed her to exploit the kindness of communities while devastating the lives of vulnerable minors who had been transformed into props in an elaborate criminal enterprise. Clara's true identity began to emerge through painstaking detective work that connected her to missing person reports filed years earlier in Arizona, where a young mother named Lena Morales had disappeared along with her 4-year-old daughter during a domestic dispute that had attracted minimal police attention at the time. The photograph that Clara had hidden in her coat's lining became the key that unlocked her past, facial recognition software confirming her identity as Amelia Morales, the daughter of a woman whose body had been found weeks after her disappearance, but whose child had simply vanished into a system that failed to protect those who needed it most. Elena delivered the news of her mother's death with the gentle honesty that Clara deserved, holding the child's hand as tears flowed freely for the first time since her rescue, grief and relief intertwining in a complex emotional response that marked the beginning of a healing process that would take years to complete. The reunion with Nancy Torres, the woman who had worked alongside Lena at the shelter and had never stopped searching for the missing child, provided Clara with a connection to her mother's memory and a glimpse of the love that had surrounded her before Melissa's criminal enterprise had torn her family apart. Shadow's role in the rescue earned him recognition that extended far beyond their small community, but Elena knew that for her partner, the medals and ceremonies mattered far less than the moment when Clara took her first unassisted steps in the hospital corridor, her legs shaky but determined as she walked toward a future that finally belonged to her, rather than someone else's criminal ambitions. In the months that followed Clara's rescue, stories began to emerge from across the country of other children who had found the courage to speak out after learning about the girl whose silence had been broken by a dog's determined bark, creating a ripple effect that transformed one act of heroism into a movement that would save countless other lives. Letters arrived at the police station addressed to Shadow and Elena from children who had been trapped in similar situations, their handwritten words describing how Clara's story had inspired them to trust adults who might listen, to believe that rescue was possible even when hope seemed lost, and to understand that sometimes the greatest act of bravery was simply refusing to remain quiet when silence served only to protect those who caused harm. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children documented a measurable increase in reports of suspected child trafficking and exploitation cases in the weeks following the media coverage of Clara's rescue, with social workers and teachers across the nation becoming more attuned to the subtle signs that might indicate a child was being held against their will or used for fraudulent purposes. Dr. Amanda Foster, a child psychologist who specialized in trauma recovery, published a groundbreaking study on the unique challenges faced by children who had been systematically drugged to simulate disabilities. Her research, funded by donations from people who had been moved by Clara's story and wanted to ensure that other victims would receive the specialized care they needed to rebuild their lives. The study revealed that traditional therapy approaches were often inadequate for children whose reality had been chemically altered for extended periods, requiring innovative treatment protocols that addressed both the physical effects of prolonged drug exposure and the psychological trauma of having their own bodies turned against them by trusted caregivers. Eleanor found herself traveling to conferences and training seminars across the country, sharing her experience with other law enforcement officers and teaching them to recognize the signs that Shadow had detected through instinct and training. Her presentations always emphasizing the critical importance of trusting canine partners, even when their alerts seem to contradict obvious evidence or challenge comfortable assumptions about normal family situations. Shadow's fame opened doors to research opportunities that advanced the understanding of canine detection capabilities, with scientists studying how his extraordinary senses had allowed him to perceive chemical evidence of Clara's drugged state and emotional indicators of distress that human observers had missed despite prolonged contact with the child. The research revealed that dogs possessed an ability to detect stress hormones and chemical markers of trauma that far exceeded previous scientific understanding, validating the instincts of countless canine handlers who had learned to trust their partners' assessments even when they couldn't explain the basis for their animals' concerns. Foster families who had opened their homes to rescued children began requesting visits from therapy dogs, understanding that animals like Shadow provided a unique form of emotional support that helped traumatized children learn to trust again, their unconditional acceptance and non-judgmental presence creating safe spaces where healing could begin. The ripple effects extended beyond law enforcement and child protection services, inspiring changes in medical protocols that required additional verification for cases involving sudden onset paralysis in children, particularly when the supposed injuries lacked proper documentation or when caregivers displayed unusual knowledge about medications and medical terminology that seemed inconsistent with their claimed backgrounds. As winter settled over the city, like a blanket of forgotten promises, Eleanor often found herself standing at her apartment window, watching Shadow play in the snow with Clara, their laughter echoing across the courtyard where other children had joined their impromptu games, creating a scene of normalcy that still felt miraculous after everything they had endured together. Clara had made remarkable progress in her recovery, not just physically as the last traces of chemicals left her system and her natural coordination returned, but emotionally as well. her voice growing stronger with each passing day as she learned that speaking her truth brought protection rather than punishment, safety rather than suffering. Yet questions remained that haunted Elena's quiet moments, mysteries that seemed to hover at the edges of their success story like shadows that refused to be illuminated by even the brightest achievements. How had Shadow known with such certainty that Clara was in danger when trained professionals had missed the signs for months? What invisible signals had he detected that transcended the normal boundaries of canine perception and ventured into territory that science struggled to explain? Dr. Chen had theorized that Shadow might have detected the chemical signatures of the drugs in Clara's system, but that explanation failed to account for the intensity of his protective response or the way he had continued to monitor Clara's well-being long after the medical evidence had been documented and processed. Elena had witnessed her partner's extraordinary abilities countless times throughout their career together, but Clara's case had revealed layers of intuition and empathy that challenged her understanding of what was possible between species, suggesting connections that operated on frequencies beyond the reach of human comprehension. The bond that had formed between Shadow and Clara defied easy categorization, transcending the typical relationship between therapy animal and patient to become something that seemed almost mystical in its depth and precision, as if they shared a language that had been forged in the crucible of crisis and tempered by mutual recognition of suffering overcome. Sometimes Elena would catch them sitting together in perfect silence, Shadow's massive head resting on Clara's lap, while the child's small hands moved through his fur with a reverence that spoke of gratitude too profound for words, their connection radiating a peace that seemed to heal not just themselves, but everyone who witnessed their extraordinary friendship. The mystery deepened when other canine handlers began reporting similar instances of their dogs displaying unusual protective behaviors around children who were later discovered to be victims of abuse or exploitation, as if Shadow's success had somehow awakened dormant abilities in other animals or inspired their handlers to pay closer attention to signals they had previously dismissed as anomalies. Was it possible that the bond between humans and dogs contained untapped potential for detecting and preventing harm that society had barely begun to explore? Elena's investigation had saved one child and exposed one criminal enterprise, but it had also opened doorways to questions about consciousness, intuition, and the invisible connections that linked all living beings in ways that transcended scientific understanding, leaving her to wonder how many other shadows were out there, waiting for someone brave enough to listen to their silent warnings and trust in mysteries that defied explanation but demanded faith in the possibility that love could indeed conquer even the darkest forms of evil. And you, what did you think about this story? Tell us in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next videos.